Hey, y'all, I'm Bud Elliott, and this is my college football summer school series on Cover 3. I bring on the team experts from the 24/7 sports staff and ask them the questions I care about. No fluff. Which players will be toughest to replace? What position groups are sneakily better or worse than I realize? We get you the scoop on each team in 20 minutes or less. Let's go. Hey, guys, Bud Elliott here, and we are back with another episode of College Football Summer School on the Cover 3 podcast. Today, we're going to talk a little Gophers. That's Minnesota. And for that, you know who I got to bring on, my man Ryan Burns from GopherIllustrated, the foremost expert on Minnesota out there. Ryan, welcome back to the show.
I appreciate you having me back, man. Big fan of the Cover 3.
I appreciate that. So 8-4 last year, regular season, pretty solidly in the top 25 in all the power ratings. So it wasn't like they luck boxed their way to that. Had a nice performance, obviously, in the bowl game. I feel like the vibes there, I don't have a great handle on that. Like, are fans happy with where PJ Fleck has this team, or are they wanting more? I guess fans always do. But what's kind of the vibe check there?
I think folks want to see them actually make it to a Big Ten title game. They have won 8 regular season games, 3 of the last 4 seasons, which is really good for a place like the University of Minnesota. But somehow in all of those 3 seasons, they didn't find a way to make the Big Ten championship game because of different tiebreakers and whatnot. You look at that 2019 season where they were able to win 10 games, they still didn't find out a way to make it. They're undefeated going into the final 2 games of the season, and they end up dropping both. And because of that, they don't make it to Indianapolis. And so that's where now it's going to be year 7 of the Fleck era. They want to see it's going to look a lot different both on offense and defense, especially though offensively, where Minnesota graduates one of the best running backs to ever wear a Gopher uniform, and Mohamed Ibrahim. I think he was number 2 in the country last year in yards after contact behind this guy you might have heard on, Bijan Robinson. So they leaned on him heavily. They only threw the ball more than the service academies, and that's going to change a lot now as we usher in what is going to be the Ethan Kaliak-Manis era here at the University of Minnesota. 4-star prospect on 24/7 Sports when he came out of high school in 2020, was one of those COVID guys that signed, but he has impressed since he has put on the uniform. And you saw the flashes when Minnesota beat Wisconsin last year in Camp Randall. He threw for over 300 yards, which when we're talking about a team that was them in the service academies for passing attempts for most of the year, the offense just completely changes when you have a guy like Ethan Kaliak-Manis. So for Minnesota this year, I think there's going to be bumps in the road. Number one, the schedule, I think, is awfully daunting with Ohio State and Michigan on it. Plus, you travel to Iowa City, where you haven't won since 1999. But I do think that as this team goes from game 1 to game 13, they're going to get a lot better. I mean, Minnesota here in 2023, I think will be fine. I think they're probably a 7-ish win team. But 2024 is where I think this team has a chance to be really special if they can hold everybody off in the portal and get everybody back for one more year.
So let's focus on offense a little bit more. Last year, just a pretty disappointing effort. As you mentioned, you did have a great running back, and yet you lost games in which they allowed 20, 26, and 13 points, which in 2022, you generally feel like you want to win if you're holding the opponent to those numbers. On a down-to-down basis, the offense had some efficiency, but it just had zero explosiveness. I mean, one of the absolute least explosive Power 5 offenses in the country. And the passing game, just terrible. I mean, like more touchdowns. Well, not more touchdowns, or excuse me, yes, more touchdowns than picks, but not by a lot. The completion percentage. Sell me on Kaliak-Manis. Like this is interesting. I think he's got a big arm. The numbers last year were pretty bad, though. I mean, negative touchdown interception ratio, 54% completions, a really high number of sacks relative to the amount of pressure allowed. What are you seeing that the numbers aren't capturing? This is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a little bit about last year's offense. It was essentially the Mo offense. That's what Fleck called it here. They haven't had any trust in the receivers both of the last 2 seasons, whether it's between injuries. Their number 1 receiver went down in the non-conference, tore his ACL and meniscus. Chris Ottman-Bell, he's coming back for a 7th year. They just really couldn't find, to your point, any explosive plays. We had talked with the offensive coordinator at the time, Kirk Shiraka, who's now at Rutgers running it, about those explosive plays because they just weren't generating any. It's so tough because you would see them have 10, 12, 14, 16 play drives. And as much as I enjoy watching things like that, I would love to see a 5-play, 75-yard drive. And so they were lacking explosiveness, and they knew it. And so that's where you look at what they've done here with the transfer portal. Replacing Mo Ibrahim is going to be Sean Tyler, someone Minnesota flipped from Oklahoma State, a Western Michigan transfer. very explosive in his time at Western Michigan, 2-time All-MAC, someone that averaged over 6 yards a carry, had multiple return touchdowns. He's one of the fastest guys on the team. And that was one of the issues last year. Mo was fantastic, and I will really never say a bad thing about him. But the one knock on him was his speed. He would get to green, and he wouldn't be able to finish it. When Sean Tyler gets to green, he's going to be able to finish it. But then you also look at what Minnesota did in terms of bringing in a couple of receivers. One by the name of Elijah Spencer was the 2021 Conference USA Freshman of the Year as a true freshman. Improved upon that performance in 2022, and I thought he looked the part here this spring at a giant spring game, even though I'm not one to put a ton on spring game performances. But Minnesota also brought in Corey Crooms, who was one of the best slot receivers last year in the MAC. Second team All-MAC last year, really good PFF numbers. And so that's where Minnesota knows that last year the strength was their offensive line and their running backs. Well, they lost their starting 3 interior guys, including John Michael Schmitz, top 60 pick of the New York Giants. And now it's revolving back to, you have Brevin Spanford, who I think is going to be one of the best tight ends in college football. His PFF grades were in the high 80s last year, only dropped 3 passes, caught the most amount of passes a Minnesota tight end has had since 2006. But to your point, they knew they needed to get more explosive. And that's where you look at what they've done. They bring in Sean Tyler, they bring in Elijah Spencer, they bring in Corey Crooms, you return Brevin Spanford, and then you have Athan. To your point, the numbers weren't great at times. And that's where, when he did get in, it was usually in garbage time against Illinois. And then Tanner Morgan goes down. His first career starts in a whiteout against Penn State, which I don't wish that upon anyone. Yeah. But you look at how he improved over those last couple of games of the season. 300 yards, like I mentioned, against Wisconsin. I just think that, like I said, 2023, there's going to be some bumps along the road of the Athan Kaliak-Manis era. But I will plant the flag that Minnesota hasn't had a quarterback drafted since the 1960s. It's been really bad for a long time here. I think if Athan hits his ceiling here in the next couple of seasons, I don't think we'll start to see that certainly this year, but I think he can finally end the drought. I think he's that talented, and you see enough flashes that they are building this offense around the Greek rifle, is what they call him here. And so it's going to be some bumps in the road in 2023, but like I said, that's things where I think they're gearing up for 2024, but their skills and their strengths revolve from last year was the running game to this year. It's going to be the passing game.
You mentioned last year a strong offensive line to lean on. Obviously, the best center in the country, 2 guards who also depart, who were third team All Big Ten. How big of a step back are you anticipating for this group?
It'll be a step back to me. Again, when you're replacing 3 6-year guys who all had great PFF grades, all were an integral part of what they did. You do return 2 of the starters from last year. Your left tackle, Ariante Ursary, who Minnesota's incredibly high on, it was up and down performance, I think, in year 1 for him. They're going to slide in Quinn Carroll from right tackle to right guard. He was a Notre Dame transfer, started every game at right tackle for them, had great run game numbers, struggled against these faster edge players, so they're going to move him into guard. So you've mitigated some of that. At right tackle, you're either going to have a 5th-year guy in Martez Lewis or a different 5th-year guy in J.J. Gade. Same thing goes at center. You're going to have a 6-year guy likely in Nathan Bowe. So they're going to be old up front. They're going to be inexperienced. I think left guard is going to be a spot to watch in terms of how they try to mitigate that. But I also think Kaliak-Manis's I would say athletic abilities to move the pocket, probably do some more sprint outs, boot outs, because Minnesota knows that they're probably going to take a step back up front. You're going to have 4 new starters at different spots with Quinn Carroll moving around, but they are going to be old. I mean, if there's one thing I've seen through a few rebuilds, whether it was the Tim Brewster era or the Jerry Kill era, I hate playing 1st and 2nd year guys in the Big Ten because more times than not, you're going against grown men that are 22, 23, and even in the COVID era, 24 years old. And so that's where they have enough guys. It's just trying to figure out the best combination. And that's what Brian Callahan, their offensive line coach, is trying to figure out.
Sounds like the offense will look different. The defense will still need to carry it, though, which, hey, recent years in Minnesota, that has not been a problem.
No, Joe Rossi's got this thing moving, man. I mean,
he does, man. Like, Joe Rossi knows what he's doing. This is...
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be you look at why they were so successful last year. I think they didn't allow more than 20 or more points in their final, I think, 7 games of the season since that Penn State game. If you're only allowing that, I think you're going to have a chance in every football game. They were tremendous on 3rd down last season. I think they ended the season number 2 in the country in terms of getting off the field on third down. And they did all that with an incredibly mediocre pass rush. It was terrible.
Yeah.
And I have said multiple times, I think that 22 defensive line was the most underachieving unit in the Fleck era here. For the amount of talent I think they have there, it just didn't click with Brick Haley in his only year here. Now he's the Purdue defensive line coach. I'll tell you, it's been a breath of fresh air to see, I think, more opportunity for some different guys up front. They do lose Trill Carter to Texas. That one surprised me a little bit because I thought he was incredibly up and down, and he took transfer visits to places like Ohio State or even Illinois, who, again, I think Illinois' front seven and defensive line specifically is tremendous. Even Illinois wanting him surprised me a little bit. But to me, this Rossi defense does two things incredibly, incredibly well, which you'll see every year. They limit explosive plays, and they bend, don't break in the red zone. So, like I do, if you have to force a team to drive 8, 10, 12, 14 plays, especially in college football, there's a great opportunity for them to make a mistake. And so that's what you've seen now from Joe Rossi is they limit explosive plays, they get off the field on third down, and when you do those two things, even with only one NFL draft pick on that defense last year, I think you're doing pretty well.
I don't know if you guys get to watch scrimmages at Minnesota, but just clicked in my head that given Rossi's defensive style and given Minnesota's lack of explosive plays last year, like those scrimmages had to be just grueling to watch, right? All right, a 27-play field goal drive for the Minnesota offense against the Minnesota defense.
Yeah, I mean, it was it's the movable object, that whole thing. So it wasn't great at times. I 100% agree with you.
I don't know the way to ask this, and I don't intend it to be obviously, like I talk about Joe Rossi on Cover 3. We've talked about him several years in a row on Summer School. This defense rated like top 10 adjusted for opponent, and yet I'm still looking at this. I'm like, how much of this is like they just played some horrendous offenses down the stretch too? Like, does this talent-wise, you mentioned they had one guy drafted, and yet top 10 defense. Like the coaching job done there is awesome. I also wonder like how much is actually related to some of the offenses that they played down the stretch that were just kind of incompetent, if you will. But I guess I don't have a question. Does this feel like a top 10 defense to you, like nationally?
I would say if you're looking for star power, no. It's not. It's not the horses that you see on the Georgias and the Alabamas of the world, certainly. But as a collective unit, I would argue it's the whole Phil Parker effect to a lesser extent, probably here. Phil Parker is so good at Iowa, getting 1 through 11 on that defense to buy into what they're doing. And that's what we've seen here at Minnesota is they can get those guys to buy in. And so that's where I talk about that defensive line didn't have anybody on there last year. And now, again, I think that they have a chance to be a lot better up front. Everybody gets another year of experience. They got some things to replace a linebacker and a corner, but they got one of the best safeties in the country. And Tyler Nubin, who returns, would have been a top 100 draft pick. In the last draft, he's hoping to go on that Antoine Winfield range of that 28 to 40, where Antoine went. But it's just getting people to buy in to just do your job. They had a kid a couple years ago by the name of Boye Mafe, ended up being a second-round pick of the Seattle Seahawks. And they benched him for a time to start the 2021 season because he wasn't playing hard against the run. I wouldn't say it goes as far as it's the whole Lucas Van Ness thing at Iowa where he never started a game and became a first-round draft pick. But if you're not going to do your job here, Rossi and these coaches are going to notice. But it's the buy-in from 1 to 11 to the do your job. And the scheme is so sound that Rossi knows what he's doing. And if everybody buys in, you're going to limit these explosive plays.
Ryan, you mentioned that they do lose quite a bit at linebacker. Two pretty good linebackers are very productive, drafted or not still. What is your level of expectation for that room this year?
It's not incredibly high. I do think they probably take a step back there. You have Mariano Sori-Marin ending his eligibility, played a ton of football for Minnesota the last 4 years. You lose Braylon Oliver to Georgia Tech, who is a part-time player for them. Donald Willis, who was another part-time player for them. That's what the portal has done to Minnesota. Other teams, it takes their top players necessarily. For Minnesota, it has just severely taken away any depth that they might have had. Some guys want bigger roles, and they weren't going to get bigger roles. And they, I would say going from Minnesota to Georgia Tech, peace and love to Georgia Tech. I think it's a step down. Now, I also believe in the Power 2 conferences, not the Power 5, so I'm biased. But even Donald Willis going to Western Michigan, that's a complete rebuild in year one, and they're going to be lucky to win a few games. So it's going to be Cody Lindenberg who's going to have to take a step forward, someone that both Joe Rossi and PJ Fleck have said they think he's going to be the highest drafted linebacker of the Fleck tenure, whether at Western Michigan or Minnesota. Now, that's not a high bar to clear because they haven't had a ton of linebackers drafted, but he's very gifted there. And then it's going to be inexperienced. They did bring in a Western Michigan graduate transfer by the name of Ryan Seelig, played a lot of football for the Broncos the last 2 seasons, but it's just a lot of inexperience behind them. They think that they have some young guys that certainly look the part, but they got to get their feet wet. And so that's where it's going to be. It's another spot where I think there's going to be bumps in the road at times as they try to learn, other than Cody Lindenberg, who is going to be able to play a Big Ten linebacker.
This secondary last year was just dynamite, right? Like the communication, they didn't allow free runners at all. Like they allowed this team to blitz and had to blitz quite a bit at times just to get pressure. Not that they were like a crazy blitz team, but like, as you mentioned, when they got pressure, it was generally because they were sending more than you could block, not because the front was necessarily winning. They lose a couple guys here. Here they have taken 2 transfers or 1 transfer. I guess depends on how you classify the backer. I assume this unit doesn't see a big drop off, or is there cause for concern here?
My biggest worry on the entire team right now is corner.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's where you look at Terrell Smith. The light finally came on for him in year 5. Battled a lot of soft tissue injuries. Battled some just poor play at times. And then he put it together in 2022, became a 5th-round draft pick of the Chicago Bears. Their cornerback 3, Beanie Bishop, ended up hitting the portal, goes to West Virginia, and their cornerback 4 from last year, and Ryan Stapp, ended up just deciding midway through spring ball to hang up the cleats. So they have to replace a lot there. Now, they ended up bringing in a couple of transfers in terms of one from Georgia Southern, Tyler Bride, and then an Elon transfer by the name of Trayvon Jones. 2 guys that have played a lot of football, both in the Sun Belt and the FCS, guys that have played over 1,000 snaps the last 2 seasons on defense. PFF grades look promising, but it's going to be how quickly can you get them assimilated into this defense? Because behind them, it's going to be 2 second-year guys by the name of Ryan Kelly and Tariq Watson. You also got to replace your slot in terms of Michael Dixon, ended up hitting the portal, going to Rutgers. Minnesota brought in another transfer, but from southeastern Louisiana, Jack Henderson, who all conference in the FCS. PFF grades look great. I thought he passed the eye test for me here in the spring. They also brought in an Auburn transfer by the name of Craig McDonald at that same slot position. But it's going to be how quickly can these transfers get up to speed? I mean, you're not going to know on these 2 corners if you hit on them until game 1 against Nebraska. So it's going to be how quickly can they try to patch these holes. I think they've done a good job of it for a school that doesn't have a lot of NIL to offer via the portal. But it's going to be how quickly can they get them assimilated, because at safety, I talked about how I feel a lot of question marks at corner. Safety, I think, is arguably the most talented spot on the entire team, with Tyler Newman being the headliner there. So it's going to be an interesting contrast for Joe Rossi, because last year the defensive line and your safeties necessarily were kind of a little bit suspect at times. Well, now it's going to rotate to, I got questions in the linebacking core and at corner, and I feel a lot better about the safeties and the defensive line. So just like the offense, I think the strengths and weaknesses of this team have evolved from year over year.
I guess 2 things. One, Southeast Louisiana having 2 transfers that are like Minnesota level good is wild, because LSU also took a corner from Southeast Louisiana. So whoever was on that staff 4 or 5 years ago did a tremendous job of scouting some of these guys out of the high school ranks. And that's a pretty cool story. Number 2, at least with the exception of the North Carolina game, I don't think any of these teams that Minnesota plays in the month of September are teams that really scare you throwing the football. Like Nebraska, probably not going to have an amazing passing offense in week 1. Northwestern has not really played offense in about a half decade now. Louisiana Lafayette, okay, like both their kids actually missed the spring game too, quarterback wise, and were hurt at the end of the season. So I don't really know what their status is. And Eastern Michigan is not really a threat. So like you have a solid 5-6 weeks there, with the exception of having to play Drake May, which is,
right, legit.
But like if you did drop that game, it doesn't hurt you in your Big Ten West, championship chase.
Yeah, it's going to be how quickly can you get ready for Drake May and what they got going on there. Now, it's obviously a different offensive coordinator for North Carolina, but you still was going to projected to be a first-round draft pick at quarterback. Now, I'd also say I'm not the biggest Jeff Sims guy in the world. I think he's got like career completion percentage 57, 30 touchdowns, 23 interceptions. I know he's got, obviously adds a lot with his legs, but to your point, think you can look up and down the schedule. Drake May is the best quarterback they probably play with a bullet, because we're going to find out yet, who Ohio State's going to start there. JJ McCarthy's obviously very talented, but it's going to be funny because it's going to be 3 really good quarterbacks and then 9 guys who are going to be like, okay, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's how quickly can you get ready for Drake May with that secondary? And to your point, they'll at least have 2 weeks to do so beforehand.
Another note, if you want it on North Carolina, I haven't done their summer school episode yet, but I did hear through the grapevine that they think that transfer they took from Kent State, Walker, is an absolute hit at receiver. So that'll be good for the preview.
Yeah. Interesting.
All right. So where is the biggest drop off for this football team, other than quarterback, as everybody will say quarterback, between the quality of the starters and the quality of the backups? Like, what position group that just, all right, they're fine if they stay healthy, but if they don't stay healthy at this spot, they have real trouble?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say corner. If those transfer corners go down, you're going to be relying on 2 guys that have only been in college for 12 months in Tariq Watson and Rylan Kelly. And I think while the clay is there for them to be pretty good, Rylan Kelly is 6'1", ran a 4.4 in high school. Tariq Watson, great times coming out of Louisiana with the 100-meter, was one of the fastest kids in Louisiana in that cycle. I think there's just so little depth there. They might be relying on a true freshman from Georgia with the name of Zaquan Bryan, who is a near 4-star for us on 24/7 Sports. But that's the one position where I just think they've tried to address it via the portal, and I think they have. But it's going to come down to, can those transfers stay healthy? Can you get them up to speed? Because I just think those high school guys are going to need another year or 2. So I still worry a little bit about corner, because at offensive line, you're old enough. I think at running back, it's not going to be Mo Ibrahim caliber, but I never expected it to be. But I still think there's talent there. So I still will stick with corner there.
We will be checking out Gopher Illustrated every day as we watch Minnesota try to chase down that Big Ten West championship. Ryan, really appreciate the time.
Appreciate you, bud.